The year was 1981, and the world would soon be shocked by one of the most disturbing crimes in modern history. The tale of Issei Sagawa, a man whose dark fantasies morphed into unspeakable actions, begins in the quiet corners of Japan. But this wasn't just any crime. It was a grotesque act that would haunt the minds of millions and leave an indelible mark on true crime history. Issei was born with a curiosity that many would dismiss as strange at first. He was obsessed with the idea of cannibalism, a fascination that began in his youth. As he grew older, this macabre interest spiraled into an obsession that consumed him. But it wasn't until he met Renée Hartevelt, a Dutch student studying in Paris, that his twisted desires would finally be realized. Renée was beautiful, intelligent, and full of life. Everything Issei admired and longed to possess. But his obsession went beyond mere admiration. It was a hunger, a yearning he couldn't control. When the two met in Paris, what seemed like a simple friendship between two students turned into a dark and deadly trap. Issei lured Renée into his apartment under the pretense of wanting to take photographs for a project. What followed was a horrifying crime, a crime so brutal and incomprehensible that it left a scar on the collective psyche of society. He carried out a ruthless act against Renée, and in his delirium, he continued to commit atrocities that would make anyone shudder. But what truly shocked the world was not just the horrific crime itself, it was what he did afterward. Consumed by a twisted obsession, he engaged in actions that defied all sense of morality, leaving society in disbelief and raising a chilling question. What could drive a person to descend so deeply into darkness? Issei's crime did not end with his actions in the apartment. After being arrested, his case became a media sensation. The world learned that he was not only unapologetic but eerily calm about the entire ordeal. He even gave interviews describing his crime in disturbingly casual terms. His notoriety skyrocketed, and he became a sort of celebrity in his home country despite his horrific actions. But was this a mere case of a man losing his mind? Or was it a reflection of a deeper societal issue, one that speaks to the loneliness and alienation so many individuals feel? Issei's story raises unsettling questions about the nature of obsession, the human capacity for evil, and the fragility of sanity. The chilling reality is that his crime didn't just change his life. It altered the lives of those who knew Renée, and it forever tarnished the concept of human dignity. Even after serving only a brief prison sentence in France and returning to Japan, Issei remained a figure of both fascination and revulsion. As viewers, we might ask ourselves, what does this case say about the human capacity for both depravity and detachment? And perhaps more troubling, how can society help individuals who are struggling with such dark obsessions before it's too late? Have you ever wondered what drives someone to commit such a heinous act? What do you think is the line between fascination and obsession? And how do we, as a society, recognize and address these mental health challenges before they manifest in such terrifying ways? Issei Sagawa's early life seemed to offer everything one might expect from a privileged upbringing. Born into a wealthy, traditional Japanese family, he had access to the best education and comforts that money could buy. However, behind the closed doors of this prosperous home, the seeds of his future darkness were quietly taking root. From a young age, Issei was frail and sickly. His physical health was often fragile, leading to feelings of inadequacy and isolation. While many children would find solace in the support of their families or peers, Issei's emotional and psychological needs were unmet. His frailty became a constant reminder of his perceived weakness, and in the world he inhabited, this sense of inadequacy began to fester and shape his inner world in unsettling ways. The isolation he felt didn't simply stem from his health. Issei also found himself fascinated by darker themes from an early age. While other children played innocent games, he gravitated toward disturbing fantasies. He became captivated by stories like Hansel and Gretel, life where cannibalism and grotesque figures were at the heart of the narrative. These tales, far from being something he dismissed, fueled his imagination in ways that many around him couldn't comprehend. His fascination grew, morphing into an obsession that would define the course of his life. By the time Issei was 15 years old, he had come to a chilling realization. He was drawn to the idea of cannibalism. Rather than suppressing or seeking help for these urges, he kept them to himself. Despite being aware of the darkness brewing inside him, Issei never reached out for psychological help. There was no one in his life to guide him, no intervention that might have steered him away from the path he was already on. Issei's reluctance to seek help and his growing obsession were key turning points. In a society where emotional struggles are often hidden or ignored, his mental state remained unchecked, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. And as his obsession with cannibalism grew, it seemed that nothing would stand in the way of his dark desires coming to fruition. This section serves as a deep dive into the psychological development of Issei Sagawa, revealing how childhood experiences, feelings of inadequacy, and an unhealthy obsession led to his eventual crime. The narrative explores the dangerous consequences of ignoring mental health issues and the societal factors that can contribute to a person's descent into darkness. How much responsibility do we as a society have in identifying and addressing the early signs of psychological distress in individuals before it escalates into something far more dangerous? Do you think Issei's upbringing, despite its privilege, contributed to his later actions? Could early intervention have changed his path? Issei Sagawa's descent into violence wasn't a sudden or isolated event. Long before the horrific crime that would define his life, there were troubling signs that hinted at his disturbing tendencies. In 1974, while studying in Tokyo, Issei's obsession took a more dangerous turn. At the age of 24, he broke into a woman's apartment with a singular, chilling purpose: to bite her. His mind was consumed by the desire to act on his cannibalistic fantasies, but it wasn't just an abstract obsession anymore. He wanted to experience the rawness of his dark urges, a terrifying glimpse into the monster he was becoming. However, things didn't go as planned. The woman caught him in the act. She screamed, and Issei quickly fled the scene, not yet having carried out his gruesome intentions. The police were called, and he was soon apprehended for his bizarre and alarming behavior. But here's where the story takes another troubling turn. Issei's wealthy father, a man of high social standing, intervened. He used his influence and money to silence the crime. The victim, undoubtedly shaken and traumatized, was paid off. The charges were dropped, and Issei's disturbing actions were swept under the rug. No one questioned the cause of his behavior, and no one sought to address the deeper, more dangerous issues at play. For Issei, the escape from legal consequences only reinforced the belief that he could act without repercussions. This moment was crucial. It was the first clear sign that Issei's desire to act on his cannibalistic urges would not be stopped by normal societal barriers. He was emboldened, shielded by wealth and privilege. And though the crime was not carried out, it planted the seeds for what would ultimately become his horrific crime against Renée Hartevelt years later. This section delves into Issei's first foray into criminal behavior, shedding light on how a lack of accountability and the protection of wealth allowed him to evade consequences. His first attempt at violence wasn't treated as a serious threat to society, which perhaps made it easier for him to escalate his actions without fear of being stopped. What impact do you think money and privilege had on Issei's ability to evade justice? Should his actions have been taken more seriously at this stage? Do you believe that if he had faced consequences for this first crime, his later actions might have been prevented? On June 11th, 1981, Renée arrived at Issei's apartment, completely unaware of the horrific fate awaiting her. She was engrossed in poetry, a serene and artistic pursuit, one that stood in stark contrast to what was about to unfold. Issei had meticulously planned this moment, and as she remained absorbed in the verses, he made his move. His actions not only ended Renée's life, but also set off a chain of events that would shock the public. Yet for Issei, it did not end there. The obsession that consumed his mind demanded more, leading him down a path that defied all comprehension. The chilling details of the crime did not end there. When Issei was eventually arrested, he seemed disturbingly calm about his actions. There was no remorse, no regret, only an eerie detachment as he described the events in cold clinical terms. His crime, however, was not just the murder of an innocent woman. It was a profound violation of the most basic human rights. It was an act of evil that blurred the lines between madness and malevolence. This section not only recounts the events of the crime, but also delves into the disturbed psychology behind Issei's actions, depicting how his obsession with Renée led to a horrifying tragedy. His cold indifference and complete lack of remorse further amplify the chilling nature of the case, leaving the public in shock over what had transpired. What drives a person to commit such a monstrous act, and how much responsibility does society bear in recognizing early signs of psychosis? Do you think Issei's detached demeanor during his arrest reflects a deeper mental illness, or is it something more sinister, a reflection of his true nature? After carrying out the unthinkable, Issei Sagawa faced the cold reality of what he had done. But for him, the crime wasn't over. It was as if he saw the murder as just one step in a twisted process that required completion. The next task was disposing of Renée's body, and Issei knew that leaving it in his apartment would only lead to his discovery. He needed to get rid of the remains in a way that wouldn't draw attention to him. He took the pieces of Renée's body, each one carefully placed into suitcases as if assembling a grim puzzle. His next plan was to dispose of the remains in a public park in Paris, a place he thought would provide him with the anonymity he desired. Surrounded by the bustle of city life and unaware of the eyes around him, he believed that this busy spot would offer the perfect cover to erase all evidence. However, as he moved through the city, carrying the heavy weight of his actions, he failed to recognize just how far his mind had strayed from reality, lost in his own delusions. Issei's strange behavior did not go unnoticed. As he lugged the heavy suitcases through the streets, something about his actions seemed off. A passerby, noticing the oddity of the situation, became suspicious of the man and his load. When Issei finally reached the park and began to leave the suitcases near a pond, the passerby's curiosity got the better of them. They approached the abandoned suitcases and, with a sense of dread, opened them. When the police arrived, Issei did not resist. He didn't panic or try to flee. Instead, he calmly confessed to the crime, revealing the horrifying details of what he had done. His lack of fear or remorse was chilling. He explained the murder and cannibalism without hesitation, offering no excuse or justification, just a matter-of-fact account of his horrific actions. In that moment, it was clear that Issei Sagawa had crossed a line from which there was no return. This section highlights the failed attempt to dispose of Renée's remains, emphasizing the absurdity and coldness of Issei's actions as he tried to carry on with his life after committing the crime. His lack of concern for being caught and the way he spoke about the crime in such a detached manner creates a sense of unease and disgust. Is Issei's immediate confession a sign of his disturbed mind? Or could it be a form of psychological detachment from the gravity of his crime? What do you think drove Issei to so coldly dispose of the body in a public park? Was it a reflection of his belief that he could get away with it? Or was it something deeper, a compulsion to be caught? After his arrest, Issei Sagawa's case took yet another chilling turn, not in the courtroom, but in the psychiatric assessments that followed. Upon his capture, Issei was declared legally insane by French authorities. His calm demeanor, lack of remorse, and the way he spoke about his crime led psychiatrists to believe that he was suffering from a severe mental disorder. As a result, he was placed in a mental institution in France, where he would remain for several years. To the public, it seemed as though justice had been served. A man who had committed an unthinkable crime was locked away in a psychiatric facility where he would presumably get the treatment he needed. But the reality was far more complex. Despite his horrifying actions, Issei's situation was clouded by legal technicalities that would prove to be his undoing. In 1985, after being held for a few years, French authorities decided to deport him to Japan. However, what they didn't anticipate was that Japanese courts would find themselves unable to prosecute him due to a critical flaw in the paperwork. Essential legal documents that could have moved the case forward were either missing or incomplete. This gap in the legal system meant that Issei could not be tried for his crime in Japan. In what can only be described as a tragic loophole in the judicial system, Issei was released. After spending just 15 months in detention, a mere fraction of the time that many expected he would serve, he was set free. The shocking part wasn't just the quick release, but that he lived a relatively unencumbered life after his freedom. Despite the horror he had inflicted upon Renée Hartevelt and the notoriety of his crime, Issei was able to move about society with few consequences. Issei's release highlighted a fundamental flaw in the justice system, not just in France, but globally. Legal technicalities, missing documents, and loopholes allowed a man who had committed such a heinous act to walk free. His case served as a haunting reminder of the gaps that exist in legal processes and the real-world consequences when those gaps are exploited. Once back in Japan, Issei took advantage of his newfound freedom. He became something of a macabre celebrity, making public appearances and even writing books about his crime. His story, though horrific, became a source of fascination for many, as his ability to live freely despite his past raised unsettling questions about the nature of justice and punishment. This section addresses the disturbing legal loopholes that allowed Issei Sagawa to escape the full consequences of his crime. His release, despite the horrific nature of his actions, raises profound questions about the integrity of the legal system and its ability to hold individuals accountable, especially when legal documents or procedures are missing or flawed. How do you feel about Issei's release due to legal technicalities? Does it undermine the idea of justice, or is it a reflection of the flaws in the legal system? What do you think the role of society is in holding individuals accountable when the justice system fails to do so? After his release from Japan's legal system, Issei Sagawa's story took an unexpected turn. Instead of fading into obscurity or facing public scorn, he became a controversial celebrity. His notoriety, coupled with his chilling indifference to the crime he had committed, made him an object of both fascination and revulsion. The media, always hungry for sensational stories, found Issei's tale to be a goldmine, one that blurred the line between true crime and bizarre celebrity. Issei capitalized on this newfound attention. He wrote books about his experiences, offering disturbingly candid accounts of his crime and his cannibalistic desires. These works, though morbid and unsettling, were sold to the public, and Issei gained a following of curious individuals and those intrigued by his disturbing journey into darkness. He made television appearances where he spoke about his past with cold detachment, offering no apology, no remorse, and no sign of regret. In his mind, he was simply telling his story, as though his actions were just a part of the narrative he had crafted for himself. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of his post-crime life was his admission that his cannibalistic desires had never gone away. Issei openly confessed in interviews that despite having been caught and incarcerated for his crime, the urges he felt towards cannibalism still lingered. The lack of remorse was not just an act, it was a reflection of his true nature. He was not the remorseful, reformed individual society might have hoped for, but rather a man who continued to revel in the darkness of his past. In an even more disturbing twist, Issei took on the role of a restaurant critic, where he was able to share his opinion on food in public forums. This might have seemed like a normal career for someone trying to reintegrate into society, but to those who remembered his crimes, it was a grim reminder of the twisted nature of his past. He had been a cannibal, and now he was reviewing food for a living, a grotesque irony that only deepened the sense of unease around him. Issei didn't stop there. He also became a painter, creating artwork that, among other things, focused on nude women. His paintings, though not overtly violent, carried with them an unsettling undercurrent, as if his art, like everything else in his life, was influenced by his deep-seated desires. Public reaction to his celebrity was mixed. On one hand, there were those who viewed him as an outcast, a man who should have remained hidden from society after committing such a horrific crime. On the other hand, there were those who were drawn to his story, fascinated by the idea of understanding a man who had committed such a gruesome act and yet seemed so unfazed by it. His media appearances, his books, and his art made him a figure of macabre intrigue. But for many, the fact that he could live so freely, without remorse and without real consequences, left a bad taste in their mouths, a sense that justice had failed in its truest form. This section focuses on how Issei Sagawa turned his infamy into a bizarre form of celebrity, using his chilling lack of remorse to gain media attention and public fascination. His post-crime activities, including writing, television appearances, and even art, serve as a stark reminder of how some individuals can turn horrific actions into a spectacle, but forcing society to question its handling of such cases. As the years passed, Issei Sagawa's life continued to be marked by a grotesque blend of fame and infamy. However, in 2013, a turn of events would alter the trajectory of his life once again, though not in the way he might have expected. At the age of 63, Issei suffered a severe brain injury that left him paralyzed. The once macabre celebrity who had freely lived his life after his crime was now dependent on others for basic care. The very man who had once been free to speak openly about his cannibalistic desires and live in the public eye was now physically unable to care for himself. Despite his physical weakness, Issei's twisted thinking remained unchanged. His desires, not weakened by the limitations of his body, seemed to have only become more pronounced. He expressed in uncertain words a strange desire to be taken to the afterlife by a beautiful woman. This statement, which seemed like the delusion of a man about to enter the afterlife, was instead a reflection of the deep darkness that had shaped his life. Even in his weakened state, Issei still clung to his unhealthy fantasies, showing that his distorted psyche had never truly evolved or healed. His desire to be freed in such a distorted way was not a cry for help, but an extension of the strange desires he had lived with for a long time. But Issei's story took an even darker turn when, in an unsettling revelation, his younger brother admitted to having similar urges. This admission raised even more questions about the psychological state of the Sagawa family. Was Issei's behavior the result of a rare and extreme mental disorder, or was there something in his family's genetic makeup or upbringing that contributed to his disturbing tendencies? The idea that Issei's brother shared these same desires only added to the chilling complexity of the case. It suggested that the seeds of such darkness may not have been isolated to Issei alone, but could have been a troubling pattern within the family. For many, these revelations deepened the mystery surrounding Issei's life. How much of his violence was a product of his mind, and how much was shaped by his family environment? Was there a hereditary component to his twisted fantasies, or was it simply a matter of the world around him failing to intervene early enough? This section delves into the decline of Issei Sagawa's health and the continued presence of his disturbing desires, as well as the unsettling revelation about his younger brother's similar urges. It underscores how his twisted mindset never fully faded, even in the face of physical deterioration, and raises troubling questions about the psychological state of his family. As the story of Issei Sagawa comes to a close, it's impossible not to feel a sense of deep unease, especially when considering the lack of true justice for Renée Hartevelt. Her brutal murder, an unimaginable violation of not only her body but her humanity, was met with an incomplete and flawed legal system that failed to properly punish the man responsible. Issei, despite committing such a horrific crime, was never held fully accountable. Instead, he was treated like a celebrity, able to exploit his notoriety for profit and public attention. His books, TV appearances, and even his artwork allowed him to continue living in the public eye, while Renée's life was reduced to a mere footnote in his twisted narrative. It's deeply unsettling to think about the kind of person Issei became after the crime. Instead of taking responsibility or showing any remorse for the life he took, he turned his infamy into a means of financial gain. His celebrity status in Japan, where he was even given a platform as a restaurant critic, seemed to only validate his belief that he could escape the consequences of his actions. For many, this speaks to a much larger issue: how society sometimes enables the very people it should condemn, turning criminals into figures of public fascination rather than holding them accountable for their horrific acts. Even in his later years, incapacitated by a brain injury, Issei's mindset showed no signs of change. His violent fantasies and twisted desires remained, and the chilling fact that his younger brother admitted to having similar urges raises serious concerns. The question remains: could Issei or his brother have committed more crimes if given the opportunity? While Issei may no longer be physically capable of acting on his desires, the possibility that there is a dark legacy within his family, a legacy that might continue to affect others, is a haunting thought. In the end, the case of Issei Sagawa is a tragic reminder of the flaws in our systems of justice and mental health, but it's also a testament to the disturbing reality that some individuals never truly face the consequences of their actions. The true cost of his crime is measured not only by Renée's death, but by the ongoing damage his actions caused to those around him, and the deep scars left in the minds of those who witnessed his continued existence in the public eye. This final reflection on the case of Issei Sagawa emphasizes the moral and societal implications of his actions and the lack of justice for Renée. It also raises critical questions about the nature of his psychological state and the potential for further harm within his family.